Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Soens, and I want to talk this morning about building back better. Build Back Better, as you all know, was the name of the transition website launched a few days ago by the new President and Vice President-elect of the United States, which perfectly captures the societal goals for the years to come. We have to build back better, not only after coronavirus, but also in light of the climate crisis, the social divisions, and many other major issues at stake. But how do we do that? Since the start of the global coronavirus pandemic almost 1 year ago, historians have been preemptively searching pandemic history to find exactly that. Evidence on how epidemics in the past have changed society, and hopefully how they could also be a change for good. What I want to discuss with you this morning is how inequality should be at the heart of building back better discussions, both in the past as well as today. And I will do so by crossing the history of pandemics with the history of flood disasters in the North Sea area. First of all, let's be honest. Even as historians, we thought it would never happen again. We thought that, at least in the global north, our medical knowledge, our wealth, our efficient institutions and health systems would protect us from deadly pandemics like corona. The plague, cholera, TBC, malaria, that story was supposed to end exactly 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, the last time in Belgium and many other countries in the west of Europe, crude mortality rates peaked above 2% of the population. 1 in 50 people died from the Spanish flu. But look, while in March and April people were still making fun about medieval plague masks, our respect about these old medieval containment policies has grown significantly. We now look with at least some admiration to the quarantines, the registration systems, the bans on social gatherings, the purpose-built medical facilities instituted by cities like Ragusa, Dubrovnik, Venice, or the Milan of the Visconti dukes well before 1400. And yet, historical epidemic outbreaks were in many ways uncomparable with COVID-19, and luckily they were. The 14th century plague, here in the city of Maubeuge in the north of France, easily killed 25% of the population. Not once, but 3 times or 4 times with delays each time of 15 years. Every time, in 2 months' time, 1 neighbor in 4 died. Disruption must have been massive. Flagellants, dancers were moving from town to town in aesthetic manifestations of madness, fear, and joy. Joy because the day of reckoning seemed to have arrived. Joy also because they seemed to have survived so far. But did these great pandemics also change society? Yes and no. What happened if 40% of the tenants died in a village in the English Midlands, here Hell's Home, studied by Sfirazi? Well, what we see is that the great majority of their small tenancies was simply taken up by sons, daughters, by brothers, or by widows. The continuity was in fact amazing, even with 40% of the population in this little village in the Midlands killed. Of course, in a somewhat longer perspective, as Guido Alfani and many others have shown, the deadly 14th century pandemics did lead in some regions to a structural improvement in living conditions for those who survived. Laborers received better wages, better food, and had to work fewer hours. But Two remarks: building back better did not happen everywhere, and it did not happen automatically. Improvements were fiercely resisted by ruling elites and depended on collective action and benign economic conditions. In contrast, later plague waves, and also, for instance, the 19th century cholera, did nothing with society. In Thomas Piketty's famous analysis of wealth inequality in France, the impact of the different cholera pandemics is simply non-existent. There was no impact on wealth inequality. It was business as usual. And to understand why, we have to introduce yet another element in the analysis. Cholera in the 19th century was a problem of poverty, both in reality and in perception. It was associated with poor, overcrowded neighborhoods in dirty, industrializing cities. Here in Brussels, the hotspots of the cholera in 1866 were the Marollen neighborhood in the south of the city, the pure working class neighborhood, or the new shanty towns in the east of the old city. When pandemics were only poor people problem, as they were in the 19th century, they are not seen as a threat to society. And nothing changed at all. That's the cynical lesson of history. This is not always the case, however. In some African countries today, Congo-Kinshasa, for instance, corona is la maladie des riches. It's a rich man problem, isolated to rich neighborhoods. And likewise, in 1400 in Dijon, the rich capital of Burgundy, plague first and foremost hit the wealthy trade districts in the north of the city. And that's logic in a way, because epidemic diseases spread through contact. And in these neighborhoods, there was a lot of traffic, a lot of contact with people coming in from everywhere in Europe and beyond. In London, we see how society could overcome this problem. In the 16th century, we still find the same pattern with the rich neighborhoods in the wealthy heart of the city, particularly vulnerable to the outbreak of plague. But at the time of the Great Plague of London in 1665 in the 17th century, plague was kept outside the city walls. It was isolated to the overcrowded, poor suburbs of the city. A deadly nexus between pandemics and poverty had come into existence. And this partly explains why the pandemics also remained recurrent. They thrived on poor and weak bodies, and the incentive to eradicate them was absent, because the wealthy and the upper middle classes had learned how to protect themselves rather efficiently. Only at the end of the 19th century, this status quo was broken. And that's the story of Pasteur and Koch. That's the story of vaccinations and antibiotics. It's a story of real progress in medical sciences. But it's not only that. It's also the story of social struggle and effective social policies. After the Second World War, there simply were less vulnerable bodies. The question now is how building back post-corona will happen. Historically speaking, there are two roads visible. There is a 20th century solution with better technology, real progress in material and biological living conditions. But the solution was predicated upon rapid economic growth, which could subsequently be reallocated, redistributed. What we learn today is that corona is already disproportionately affecting poor and vulnerable groups in society. So there is a real risk that the escape from pandemics might unfold along an older path, the path of the cholera, the path of the Great Plague of London. As pandemics are successfully isolated to a problem of underprivileged, poor and politically powerless people, they stop to be a threat for society as a whole, and they often become recurrent or endemic? Or is there perhaps a third road for building back better? And it's for this purpose that we have to turn to the history of flood disasters. First of all, let's be sure, flood disasters are less lethal dangers compared to pandemics. My favorite Wikipedia page for students is this list of deadliest floods. It's pure fiction. Flood disasters didn't usually kill 10,000s of people, let alone 500,000 or 1 million people. That's fiction, that's rubbish. If we turn to the North Sea area and we restrict ourselves to reliable evidence on who actually died in flood disasters, the evidence is rather straightforward. Let's take the All Saints flood, exactly 450 years ago. Apart from chronicles citing 100,000 casualties, we also dispose of some very accurate information by agents of the Governor General of the Low Countries, the infamous Duke of Alba. In Dordrecht, Rentmeester Andries van der Goes gives a lengthy overview of the damage and the casualties in a letter from the 13th of November. He says in Dordrecht, the whole city has been flooded, but in the lower parts of the city, the water reaches to the attics of the houses. And it's in these lower parts of the city that 4 or 5 women have been drowned. In Papendrecht, the whole polder has been submerged and a lot of cattle has drowned. But few people, luckily, have been killed. In Scheveningen near The Hague, more than 90 houses along the coast have been washed away. This kind of assessment is very much in line with other eyewitnesses of 16th century floods. Who was likely to be killed in a flood? These were people living in low-quality houses close to seawalls or on low-lying locations in the landscape. These were people trying to save their belongings in the basements of their houses. These were crews of ships in the middle of a storm. This was the labor force working on seawalls, which often slept in shacks immediately near the coast, as is very accurately depicted on this 18th century painting of an embankment in the north of Flanders. Of course, there are some exceptions of flood disasters which indeed killed 1,000 people and more, but these exceptions can be attributed to very specific conditions where a lot of vulnerable people were concentrated on very vulnerable locations in the landscape. And the best, and in fact the only example in the Low Countries, is the Golden Age Waddenzee region. In 1570, there is for the first time reliable evidence of a few thousand people from Frisia to the coast of Denmark killed in the flood. The same is true for 3 other floods in the 17th and early 18th century Waddenzee area. But who were these victims? In 1570, we can only identify them for the Amt Ezens along the Eems estuary in the northeast of what is today Germany. We find a tremendous social bias in the victims, with most of the victims counted in households with little or no cattle, where 82% of the houses was destroyed by the flood. In contrast, only 7% of the houses in the upper quartile of society was destroyed. And for the other floods, we have similar evidence. How can we explain this? This is the story, first of all, of the very aggressive landscape management of the Golden Age Waddenzee area. In a few decades' time, the huge amounts of Kwelder salt marsh outside the old medieval seawalls were reclaimed for the first time in history. This disturbs the traditional flood protection system completely. It exposed seawalls directly to the power of the waves, besides making dike repairs much more difficult, as we could recently demonstrate for recent and historic floods in this area. Moreover, the new reclamations were also paralleled by increasing residential segregation. low quality housing in the newly reclaimed lands versus elite housing on high and safe spots, by and large concentrated behind the old medieval dikes. In the southwest of the Low Countries, we see the same basic mechanism of high-risk engagement with the environment and the same isolation of risks to underprivileged groups. In this polder near Antwerp, the Doelpolder, the residential segregation between the large farms in the middle of the polder in blue here and the hamlets with the laborers in red here, immediately at the foot of the seawalls, is astonishing. In this region, the southwest of the Low Countries, the death count of floods was lower due to environmental differences and probably also due to the rapid rise of a new class of wealthy tenant farmers with at least some political leverage to improve the quality of flood protection. But the basic mechanisms are pretty much the same. And this is proven by the last major flood disaster in 1953, where once again social inequality was perfectly mirrored in the profile of the flood victims. And it worked through residential segregation. So yes, the amphibious culture of the pre-modern Low Countries, as Petra van Dam has very adequately labeled it, provided a rather successful management of floods, including rapid recovery and a limitation of losses, of lives and economic losses, except for those who were at the margins of society. So are there any parallels with pandemics? Absolutely. First of all, society always bounces back. There's no problem. Secondly, both with regard to floods and pandemics, societies often learned how to protect themselves from peak mortality, but they did so by isolating the risk to groups at the margins of society. And in a cynical way, this social isolation of disaster risks helped a rapid recovery from the disaster, and society at large was never vulnerable. And fourthly, the only way back of building back better seems to have been the 20th century solution of great improvements in infrastructure and the aggregate reduction of poverty and the aggregate improvement of living conditions and health conditions. But perhaps there is a third road, and perhaps we can find it in the history of flood protection. As a matter of fact, for 20 years now, the grand strategy of flood protection has changed. We no longer aim to contain the water absolutely through hard technology alone, but we also give room to the water. We have to learn to live with the water, to accommodate the water, and to create a buffer capacity. In a way, this is a perfect return to the grand strategy of coastal populations 1,000 years ago, to the time of the Terp societies, which knew how to accommodate floodwaters. It's also a return to the pluriactive coastal peasantries, which combined dryland activities, dryland farming, agriculture, with wetland activities, fishing, reed cutting, peat digging, and so on. Hence reducing the potential impact of floods on their income. These coastal peasantries, which did not hesitate to move entire settlements if flood problems became overwhelming. Can you also give room to a virus just as you give room to the water? No, of course, that's not possible. But you can admit that epidemic diseases, just like floods, will always return and cannot be eradicated absolutely. You can reorganize society so you can buffer the next epidemic outbreak. How do you do that? You can prepare for the pandemic. No more lean production and just-in-time supplies, but more local stocks, more buffer capacity in intensive healthcare. Just like the Finnish, we should all become preppers in a way. Secondly, while the 20th century solution was all about improving aggregate living conditions, aggregate material well-being, aggregate health conditions, what is needed now is a reduction in health inequalities, which are growing dramatically, which are fueling the coronavirus pandemic. In my privileged part of the world, the gap in life expectancy between the most and the least privileged quartile of society is 9 years for the male population. That's astonishing. Finally, giving room to the virus is also about nature. It's about eradicating these unsustainable encroachments on wild nature, as testified by the culling of the mink farms happening today. In the end, it's all about prudence. It's all about what McCloskey has called the prudence of the peasants, the realization that the buffering of natural variability is an important and integral part of well-being. And in the end, it might be more important than profit maximization. Shock buffering should be seen as part of well-being. Thank you, and I look forward to discuss this with you.